Last week, there was a wonderful field trip that I wasn't able to go to. I was very gutted near Taupo with the New Zealand Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, organised by our next guest, Chair Grant Bunting, also from ANZCO, who joins us now. Good evening, Grant.
Hi, Sarah.
Now, this article that Annette Scott's put up on farmersweekly.co.nz is really highlighting the pilot work that you've done with 6 farms to move towards more verified sustainable beef. What I'm really interested in is these defined standards for New Zealand. What do they look like?
Well, the standard itself is an adaptation on what's commonly known at the moment as NZFAP. So NZFAP, for want of explanation on the acronym, was born out of RMPP, and it dates back probably 2 or 3 years ago now, where all meat companies had their own farm assurance programs, and we sought to adopt the national standard essentially. And those basic fundamental farm assurance programs were born about, I think, historically on the requirements out of the UK for export lamb. The evolution of that has seen us evolve what is the basic NZFAP. There is an acronym issue here, but NZFAP Plus seeks to overlay sustainable values on what is a basic farm assurance program as it stands now.
Okay, well, smacking the heads of the red meat sector together is probably second to the bottom of doing it with the wool industry, let's be honest, Grant. But this pilot program is 50-50 funded between MPI and industry, with, of course, ANZCO Food, Silver Fern Farms, Greenlee, and the likes of McDonald's and World Wildlife Fund, among others. When you were talking there about the farm assurance program, I remember doing an interview with David Surveyor, CEO for Alliance Group, who I see now have come to the table. And there was a lot of dismissal of this farm assurance program at the start by the processors that we have our own, ours are far superior than the national standard, and that air of arrogance around it. Where are we at now?
Well, I think historically there probably was grounds whereby those assurance programs were deemed to be reflective of competitive advantage. The reality is the market, the global market anyway now, is somewhat united in their expectations. So it's a space that I think we increasingly feel comfortable in collaborating because essentially we're all seeking to meet the same standards. So, hey, we were no different. ANZCO had its own farm assurance program for many years, and I think it's great to see the fact that everyone's moved past that now. We can all agree on a common basis, and the evolution of that with a view to sustainability, I have to say at the moment that element's still very voluntary. So this is still a draft standard, the sustainable component, and there's still some water to go under that bridge. But the 6 farmers that participated in the proof of concept have been complemented by, I think, another 35 farmers that also participated in a pilot for RMPP. And those farmers collectively have basically set about saying, look, how difficult or how hard is it to expand upon what we're already currently doing with a view to meeting a standard that, arguably is a stretch. But there's no doubt about it. The market is signalling very clearly that in time to come, there is an expectation that we will be able to demonstrate sustainable practice on farm.
Okay, I want to bring this down to the nuts and bolts, which is the numbers. And we've had Jane Smith write in to say, with Shaw's FERT tax and, as she says, Parker's power trip, and she's referring to essential fresh water. How do we stay in the black to be green? And what were some of those outcomes from those pilot programs, from the profitability, when there hasn't been a defined exponential premium on this particular program back to farmers?
Yeah, I think the key thing to remember here is farm assurance is reflective of market eligibility, right?
Yeah.
And it's very different from regulatory compliance. We would like to think in time one begets the other, but certainly at the moment, from a farm assurance perspective, all we're seeking to do is demonstrate the requirements that our customer base want to see by way of our product. There's no requirement at the moment from a farm assurance program perspective necessarily to meet the domestic regulatory framework. And I think we've got to be very clear on that, because the customer base, their expectation is, well, one would argue reflective of consumers, and it's increasingly more about what's required to satisfy market eligibility, as opposed to having to meet a hurdle or a requirement that might be imposed.
Unfortunately, we didn't have Minister James Shaw make it onto the show, and I'm being told in my ears that they certainly will be on, and they're very apologetic for not coming on. There's been a bit of discussion in the comments, Grant, about being able to achieve a 3 to 4 times price for defining regenerative farming in terms of the produce. Do you believe that that is possible from the market, especially when regenerative is hard to define in the likes of organic?
Oh, look, I find it very hard to believe. I don't even think the market knows what regenerative ag is. It's a piece of work that, under the auspices of the Roundtable, we've flagged up as seeing, is this a role we can play in defining that? But, I find that hard to fathom. What is regenerative agriculture? I'm yet to understand myself what the extent of that is. It can be bent and shaped relative to whatever argument's being made. Don't get me wrong, I think there's something to it. But I don't think the market certainly hasn't defined it. I don't think industry's defined it. I think we're all grappling with it, and it's just a convenient term at the moment if we're not careful.
Yeah, but at the same time, sometimes when US actors and government officials continuously refer to a term over and over again, it does become a part of our industry and something we should be focusing on. It does make it hard when it is a method and a mindset towards farming in your own particular ecosystem that can't be defined by marketing. So it is a real challenge.
Look, it has to be defined. I certainly don't dispute that. I just don't think it's going to be particularly easy. Again, those sound bites that often those parties that are subject to the publicity capture, the devil's in the detail a lot of the time, and it absolutely has to be defined. But I find it difficult at the moment. Certainly, if I just put my ENSCO hat on, specific to what our marketers are translating to us, they're translating a strong message around sustainable farming practices, and that's being overlaid with the reference to regenerative. But we're not seeing an urgency around quantifying what that is yet.
Okay. So I'd love to ask you, quantifying what is the word sustainable and sustainable beef then, and it's a part of the Roundtable's objectives.
Well, in the first instance, it's very much at the moment around demonstrating intent. So a lot of the work that's gone in at the moment is around behaviour. And sustainable, it's split into 3 or 4 categories, whereby you give consideration to farm practice, biodiversity, people, community, and the likes, right? So they're largely generic in their reference, but they're framed in that sense, right? And really the insistence at the moment is, really the messaging is, look, there's an acceptance that people may not have necessarily achieved, but there is an absolute requirement to demonstrate intent. And that's where this group of farmers we were fortunate to deal with, they grasped that quite quickly. There was not necessarily a fear of pass or failure, because it's not whether you pass or whether you fail. It's whether you can demonstrate, one, that you're aware and that you have an understanding that it's changing, and 2, that you're willing to consider that and demonstrate in practice that you're actually prepared to contemplate what might be a requirement that is only going to evolve.
Do you think that will be how we go with an approach to freshwater, that if we can demonstrate that we're on the right track, we may not have to be forced to have consent for every activity on farm, Grant?
Well, I think I'm much better suited to this side of the argument than politics, to be fair. Yeah, I'd like to think common sense will prevail, but It's not common, is it? That's the problem.
That's a very good point. And you know where you're also very well suited, Grant, and this is from a viewer comment, is actually of your question. When will Grant be making those cool market update videos again?
Yeah, well, to be fair, we'll have to wait till the yellow card's rescinded. Yeah.
You're being missed from social media, Grant. Isn't that such a compliment?
Oh, it is. Yeah.
Hey, fantastic, Grant. I really appreciate you coming on tonight and the work that you're doing there with the New Zealand Roundtable for Sustainable Beef.
This is Sarah's Country.